There's a wonderful little book that is filled with all sorts of wisdom that's titled Jacob the Baker, Gentle Wisdom for a Complicated World. When he's teaching his fellow bakers, Jacob holds up a fist and he says, "When our hand is made into a fist, we cannot receive the gifts of life from ourselves, our friends, or our God. When our hand is closed in a fist, we cannot hold anything but our bitterness. When we do this, we starve our stomachs and our souls. Our anger brings a famine on ourselves." There's a lot of wisdom in Jacob's words. Harboring bitterness only intensifies our despair. Advent, as the days grow shorter, is a time of darkness. It might be a time that we're wishing that it would pass quickly, but I suggest instead we need to seek God in such times. For only when we stand with our hands open to receive the Lord will we be ready to be shepherded off into a better place. Now we're again exploring those hopeful passages in Isaiah. Isaiah forms kind of a centerpiece for the Old Testament's concept of a redeeming God. This is the God that we meet fully in Jesus Christ. But the theological foundations for Christ's work is set forth in Isaiah. And today we're looking at the 35th chapter, which contains a great promise about what God is doing. Now, many scholars will suggest that chapter 34 and 35 should be read together. I'm not going to do that today. But I want us to throw that out there because these two chapters seem to be contradictory. Chapter 34 deals with God's judgment on the nations, with Edom especially selected for condemnation. The land will become a wasteland that is inhabited only by wild animals. And then, after all that talk about desolation, is followed in the 35th chapter with a promise of God's restoration. By the way, this blending of judgment and hope is something that Isaiah does very well. So let's listen now for God's word from the 35th chapter of Isaiah. And I didn't have it marked. Here it is. "The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. Strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who are of a fearful heart, be strong, do not fear. Here is your God. He will come with vengeance, with terrible recompense. He will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the speechless sing for joy. For water shall break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The burning sand shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. The haunt of the jackal shall become a swamp. The grass shall become reeds and rushes. A highway shall be there, and it shall be called the Holy Way. The unclean shall not travel on it, but it shall be for God's people. No traveler, not even fools, shall go astray. No lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast come up on it. They shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there, and the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Life in the desert is precious because everything is fighting for its share of water. Savage animals live in the desert. They have to be savage if they're going to survive. They've adapted to the climate. The sidewinder rattlesnake is one that jumps sideways as it makes its way across the ground. And it does that so it only exposes a limited portion of its underbelly to the baking rocks. Other snakes, those that slither on the ground, can be quickly fried. They can only come out at night, and they have to quickly find shade when the sun blazes. Cactus is another example of a unique survival skill. It's a plant that stores up water and then defends its water with sharp points because everything is competing in the desert for water. Many people are apprehensive about the desert. Back in 1988, when I was driving out to Virginia City, Nevada, where I was going to spend a year, I found myself worrying about driving across the 40-mile desert in Nevada. I had read horrible accounts of what the wagon trains had endured in this stretch. And it didn't help any that I picked up a nail in my tire in Elko. Was this a bad omen? I wondered. Thankfully, I was able to get the tire repaired in Lovelock, Nevada, and I made it across the desert without any problem. In the days without air conditioning, water purification systems, and deep wells, life in the desert was precarious. Today, it's a bit easier. But it's still not a place you want to run out of gas or go be stuck without water or have a flat tire. In the days of Isaiah, the desert was even more hostile, yet it's where Israel finds herself, in the desert. Before looking at chapter 35, we should just take a quick review of the 34th chapter. As I said, these two chapters appear as one unit. In the 34th chapter, judgment has descended upon the world. Everything is affected. In the first four verses, we read of those who have been slain by God's anger. In verse 5, we learn that Edom, a neighbor of Israel, is especially singled out for harsh treatment. God's wrath continues till only wild beasts, demons and buzzards and the like inhabit the land. The world is now a desert. It's an inhospitable wilderness. There's no hope on the horizon. Now, so far I've spoken about literal deserts, something that not all of us will experience, and those of us who do will probably do it on our own free will and be prepared. So let's think about deserts metaphorically. Because sooner or later, all of us are going to find ourselves in such a place. Life becomes a struggle. We may question what purpose life serves. It could be a career that seemed promising that evaporates, or a marriage upon which we've placed our hopes and our dreams unravels, or our health declines and we just don't seem to be getting any better. At such times, we're in a desert. And we might even question if it's worthwhile to continue to search for something that will quench our thirst. There's no joy. There's no hope. There's only despair. Been there yet? Most of us have at least tasted a part of what I described. We've been there at a situation that Isaiah explains in the 34th chapter, where hope seems distant as a shower of rain does in the summer desert. But then we open the 35th chapter, which begins in the wilderness with something that is strange happening. The wilderness and the dry land, we're told, are glad. The desert rejoices. Flowers bloom abundantly. Occasionally, in late winter, Death Valley, which is one of the most inhospitable places in America, is transformed into a blanket of flowers. I've once saw this in its full glory. It's a miracle that when it happens, and it only happens every 10 years or so, lasts for maybe a week or two. Soon afterwards, Death Valley is back to its natural state. Everything dries up. The miracle only happens if the valley gets significant rainfall in December and January. I expect Isaiah experienced that kind of wonder in a desert. He knew how things can change quickly. He knew about how the desert can bloom, how it can be transformed into a garden, how those seeds that lie in the soil remain dormant until a thirst-quenching rain comes along. And Isaiah uses this vision to remind his readers that God does wonderful things, that it's not all judgment and despair. God does his best work in the wilderness, in the desert, transforming a barren landscape into one of life. It's out of the crucible of judgment that God leads his people. This poem of Isaiah, which speaks of God's people returning to Zion, foretells of Christ coming into the world, coming into a world without hope, and reversing the fortunes of those with the least amount of confidence, the blind, the deaf, the lame. Water will appear as springs bursting forth in the desert, again reminding us of the living water that is Jesus Christ. A highway to paradise appears, and it's a safe road. There's no nails for tires on this road. Those waiting to leave their past behind move into God's future and are invited to journey upon it. Even fools, we're told, are not going to get lost on God's road. There'll be no danger lurking at the edges. Lions will not exist. And remember, as I pointed out last week, the Assyrians were identified as lions. But in this new Eden, ravenous beasts will stay away from those who have been ransomed by God. This message, the message of this passage, is that being in a desert is not a reason for despair, because it is in the desert that we experience the full joy of God's love. If we have such an outlook on life, the desert places are not going to be nearly as frightening. Instead, we can enter into a desert landscape with hope and anticipation of what God might be doing for us. Terry Tempest Williams, who's a Utah author who writes about the land, says this about the desert: if the desert is holy, it is because it is a forgotten place that allows us to remember the sacred. Perhaps this is why every pilgrimage to the desert is a pilgrimage to the self. There is no place to hide, and so we are found. I think Williams is onto something. When we're in the desert, be it a real one or a metaphorical one, we are exposed for who we are, and we find that we must depend upon the other, upon God. It may be that in the desert is the only quiet place for us to even be able to hear God speaking. When things go well, we're too busy to be bothered. But when things fall apart and there's no place to turn, then, and maybe only then, will we be able to listen. And these may be the moments that God speaks to us. The desert can help us define what is important. Garrison Keillor, in his book, Woebegone Boy, tells the story of John Tollefason, a man who leaves Lake Woebegone and heads off for the glitter of New York City. And John, while there, he rises to the top. He's the manager of a public radio station, and with a friend he opens a restaurant, and it seems like he's got it all together. But then comes the desert. He's fired from the radio station, and his restaurant fails. And you'd think his cheerfulness would wane, but during this desert time, he begins to realize what he really wants. And for the first time in his life, he's able to make a commitment to love, and the book ends happily with his wedding. John's desert clarified his understanding of himself. Ultimately, the desert reminds us that we can't just depend on ourselves, that we must depend on something greater, upon God. In Sacred Thirst, Meeting God in the Deserts of Our Longing, Craig Barnes points out that if we try to care for every situation that comes our way when we're in the desert, that we're going to burn ourselves up. And he says it's in the desert that we learn that we can only depend on Jesus, that He is our answer. When we're in the desert, we find that we must listen and that we must accept the help God offers if we're going to find our way out. So while I don't wish adversity on anyone, I want you to think about times that you're in such a situation. And during such a time, think about how it might be an opportunity for you to experience God. That's the hope of Christmas. Don't fear the deserts that may be before you. Instead, look at them as opportunities. Amen.